Good afternoon. Well, this will be the first panel of the Leadership Conference. It's great to see so many familiar faces and many new, old, young faces. It's wonderful to see. Our panel is titled Tax, Borrow, Spend: How Governor Wolf's Agenda Harms Pennsylvanians. Well, I don't think many of you in this room need to be reminded that a year ago, Governor Wolf proposed the largest tax increase, the largest borrowing increase, and the largest spending increase in the entire nation. Governor Wolf proposed a $4.5 billion tax increase, a 16% increase in spending, and billions of dollars in debt. It was so big that it outnumbered the other 49 states combined. In fact, the Huffington Post gave him the accolades of the most liberal governor in America. That's pretty hard to do when you're talking about California and other states. But this, of course, despite while campaigning to give the middle class a tax cut, Governor Wolf's proposals would have increased taxes on a family of four by $1,400. And the Independent Fiscal Office, calling balls and strikes, said that every income group in Pennsylvania would be paying more. Fortunately, Governor Wolf got nothing. Absolutely nothing. He claimed we had a $2.3 billion deficit and we need massive taxes to close it. Our legislature said we don't need any more taxes. We'll close that budget. We can put more money into the cost of government, despite not raising taxes. Many of you in this room did your part in supporting our state House and Senate members to thwart the governor's tax, borrow, and spend agenda. Unfortunately, while we won that battle, it continues. Governor Wolf is doubling down once again with massive tax and spending increases. And unfortunately, he doesn't understand that Pennsylvanians don't want that, nor can they afford it. Well, to help us all understand better what is at stake, who's going to be harmed, and who ultimately profits from Governor Wolf's agenda is a panel of experts that are going to enlighten us and hopefully also encourage us as to how we fight back. I believe on your tables you have questions that if you would like to scribble some out, get them up to me on stage here. We will also have time for Q&A. As I said, the title of our panel is Tax, Borrow, Spend: How Governor Wolf's Agenda Harms Pennsylvanians. The first issue we're going to tackle is taxes. My good friend David Taylor is president of the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. They are a statewide trade organization that represents the interests of manufacturers and the tens of thousands of people working in those manufacturing businesses. David.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. And I'm pleased to report it's actually 565,000 Pennsylvanians who work directly on the plant floor and as line workers and in direct supervision. And of course, that core manufacturing activity sustains millions of additional Pennsylvania jobs in supply chains and distribution networks and through vendors of industrial services. That manufacturing is the engine that drives our economy. It adds the most value, creates the most wealth, has the strongest spin-off effect on job creation. So again, one would hope that because this sector upholds prosperity for the Commonwealth, that the Commonwealth would take care that we have a good pro-growth environment for manufacturing and for other productive activities. Unfortunately, that's not the case. But just as a baseline to start the conversation, I think we all know that when government grows faster than the private economy, private sector growth suffers, which means that everybody suffers. That there are fewer jobs, wage growth is slower, it hurts families, it hurts taxpayers, it hurts employers. So rather than trying to diagnose everything that's wrong with our current tax structure, which is a lot, and all the things that Governor Wolf would like to do to make it worse, which is a PIT increase, sales tax increases. He wants to tax your insurance policies, tax the bank reserves. I want to focus on one particular tax that he just won't let go, which would be a new additional tax on the natural gas industry. Before I get to that, I do think that thanks are owed to our legislative champions who have led this fight, have won this fight, at least for the first year, to keep Governor Wolf from dramatically expanding state government and raising taxes on everyone. And in particular, you heard from him earlier, State Senator Scott Wagner, and also our friend who's been there throughout, the Speaker of the House, Mike Turzai. Thank you. So let's focus on what the natural gas tax, a new additional tax, would mean for our economy. And I want to focus on the thought of opportunity cost, which means that by doing one thing, you miss out on something else. Now, Saudi Arabia has declared war on American shale energy, oil and gas. They've got the spigots all the way open to drive the price down as low as possible to try to shatter the American growth in oil and gas development. So obviously, our foreign competitors are trying to take something away from us. This is the time when we shouldn't be helping them. I want to talk about the way the world could be. If we optimized conditions for growth with this Pennsylvania resource of natural gas from the Marcellus Shale and from the Utica Shale below it, there's been a lot of focus so far just on the drilling, and certainly that drilling activity has created a lot of wealth, but really that's just the beginning. That petrochemical manufacturing using the energy from the methane, the natural gas, but also using the ethane, propane, butane, and natural gasoline that are byproducts from the methane that come out very robustly in western Pennsylvania, like out in Washington County. Those materials are themselves manufacturing inputs. That this offers the promise of adding value the way the steel industry adds value, because you're making the stuff that other people make stuff out of. We're talking about a century of jobs, prosperity, and economic expansion. We're talking about a whole dynamic that could revitalize Pennsylvania across all 67 counties. It's a choice between that or a looter mentality of smash and grab for a paltry few more dollars for Harrisburg to spend today. And so this is why we need leaders who look to the future, who consider the consequences of tax policy on our competitiveness and on our prosperity and on our future growth. If we do this right, we can have not just the jobs in the drilling sector on the well pad, we can have jobs at the steel mill, making tubular steel for pipeline. We can have jobs building and maintaining that pipeline. We can have jobs at the manufacturing plant, powered by natural gas, using those natural gas solids as inputs. Manufacturing plants that make the gear that's used by the energy company to drill for more energy. And if we would go through the field of liquefying the natural gas, which is itself a manufacturing process, this could mean jobs at the shipyard in Philadelphia, making ships to carry Pennsylvania natural gas to sell internationally, to bring foreign capital home to the U.S. so that we're making money the way the Saudis are making money off us now. I want to live in that world. I want to live in that world. But to get there, we need our leaders in state government to recognize the potential of this sector and to seek to optimize conditions for growth rather than simply taking more because they want more.
Thank you, David. The issue of taxes, of course, is always an important thing because I know you agree. Businesses ultimately don't pay taxes.
It's true.
Only people pay taxes, and it's you and I, our neighbors, who end up paying them, even if we're going after a particular industry. Now, one of the other things that is so detrimental to growth is debt. And we know that we've got a lot of debt here in Pennsylvania, And the governor's proposed massive borrowing, billions of dollars of borrowing to pay off other debt. And in particular, that's been the only solution he has proposed for our pension crisis. That most people don't realize Pennsylvania is home to 1 out of every 4 pension systems in the entire country. That's debt that we all owe and our kids all owe as a result. State Representative Seth Grove is from York County. He's a co-founder of the Taxpayer Caucus, a bicameral body with Senator Scott Wagner, working to solve some of these things. Seth has led in some of the pension reform area. Seth, this is sort of that issue that cuts across everything. I mean, more money is going into all of our pension systems every single day, and that trajectory is still climbing. It means less money into our schools, less money into our roads, other functions of government. Tell us about the borrowing plans that are hurting Pennsylvanians and what we ought to be doing about them.
So Governor Wolf loves his taxes and he also loves his borrowing. Remember when he was running for office and he had all those cute little kids around his feet and said, listen kids, I'm going to fund your schools through this great natural resource underneath us, shale. We're going to tax and we're going to fund our schools. Well, when Governor Wolf talks about his policies, his actual policies, if you read them legislatively, they do not match up. Every single one of his shale tax legislative agenda items has always actually, the money has actually been used for alternative energy sources. Think about that. We're going to tax one energy and give it, bond it, and then give the proceeds to another energy source. It's like taxing McDonald's and giving the money to Burger King. It makes absolutely no sense. And it kills off one industry and creates capital cronyism to supplant and push forward another industry. And that was just one of his major plans. The other one was he wanted to do pension obligation bonds. Now, in theory, in academics, and that's where Governor Wolf came from, academics, on paper looks great, right? Socialism looks great. Bernie Sanders' free stuff campaign sounds great to a lot of people because I get free stuff, right? Very exciting. Unfortunately, it fails and it does not work. Every political entity that has ever done a pension obligation bond borrowed against its already assuming debt to try to pay off its debt has failed. Philadelphia, pension obligation bond, failed pension plans. York City, pension obligation bond, failed pension plans. City of Pittsburgh, pension obligation bond, failed pension plans. It doesn't work. You have to change the benefit structure and you have to actually pay the bill that's due. It's responsible governing. Now, how do you do that in the future? Now, we sent Senate Bill 1 to the governor's desk back in June, many months ago, and he vetoed it. Now, the ironic part of Senate Bill 1, it was a 401k defined contribution system. That's the way you want to go. That's how you solve the problem long term. Ironically, when he was the president of Wolf Distribution, it's the same exact pension plan he gave to his private sector employees. Think about that. You have a governor, former businessman that says, you know, 401k is good enough for the private sector, but not for public sector employees. No discrimination in between those two. Now, there's many reasons for going to a 401k plan. Number one, remove the tax, that unfunded liability. You remove it from the taxpayers. It falls on the employees long term. And let's be honest, since really the 80s, private sector has moved away from defined benefit plans because it's just not sustainable long term. The other reason is politics. You do not want politicians eyeing up a great economy, your pension plans bringing in a lot of money and saying, what if we just give a slight pension bump to some state employees and teachers for some votes on election year? That's what happened in 2001. And that's what will happen again, because at some point that unfunded liability of billions of dollars is going to be paid off. We're going to have billions of dollars in free cash that school districts are going to balloon contracts, balloon spending. Same thing at the state government side. So we really need to do that change now for the future. And let's be frank, we had a group of Supreme Court judges that were elected by unions out of Philadelphia. Highest expenditure, I think, in the history of a judicial race, union expenditure on judges. If we get any changes to current employees up to them, they're going to throw it out. It's reality. It's something we have to live with. Elections have consequences. We're dealing with Governor Wolf's election right now, and I'm proud of my colleagues. How often do you hear Republicans say we held, right? When? Think about it. I've been trying to think about it. So I'm really proud of my colleagues that we can finally say, you know, we held. I was just with Congressman Scott Perry, my local congressman, last night. He's like, guys did a hell of a job. You know, we need to take that game plan and bring it to D.C. and continue the good work you've done. But let me tell you, the amount of borrowing the governor wants to do on top of the spending and the taxes is not going to put right our ship financially. Even when he touts the S&P and the Moody's credit rating downgrades, if you read carefully, a lot of it is because his budgets spend more than what they bring in revenue. Remember, he's asking for billions in taxes. He's increasing spending by billions of dollars. He's borrowing by billions of dollars, and we still have a structural deficit because he never fixes the underlying cost drivers moving forward. So with that, contact your legislator. We may be moving pension legislation next week or the week after. Advocate the importance of switching over to 401k long-term. Remove the politics out of pensions, because you do want to guarantee and make sure retirees have their pensions. You want to make sure that taxpayers can afford those benefits moving forward. And that's the defined contribution system. It's the way we have to go, and we've got to, believe me. I'm not going to be here in 30 years when life is good, and legislators will be eyeing up those pension plans. And you know, if we don't change it now, I'm telling you, it's going to be 2001 all over again.
So we've got the taxes, we've got the borrowing, and then of course the spending. Governor Wolf consistently claims that we underfund our public schools. He says we cut spending by $1 billion, that we need to put more taxes into our schools, while at the same time wanting to deny parents the ability to make choices in their education. To talk about the spending side, specifically as it relates to education, as that's what the governor tends to lead with, of we need more money into education. James Paul, he's a policy analyst at the Commonwealth Foundation, and he's our education guy there. James is going to tell us more about the spending. James.
So Matt, you mentioned it, but let's say it again. Let's repeat the two biggest misperceptions or myths that dominate Pennsylvania politics right now, and they're related to education. The first is that our state underfunds public education, okay? And the second is that somehow under the previous administration, $1 billion was cut from K-12 education. We know that both of these are categorically false. They're untrue. They are myths, okay? But the problem is these myths are at the foundation of Governor Wolf's demands for tax increases that David laid out just a few minutes ago. It is because of these myths that Governor Wolf makes the case to voters that, well, we need to raise taxes on working families and on small businesses to be able to address the education funding issue. So I have a little homework assignment for everybody, a little charge. The next time you hear anyone say that we underfund education in Pennsylvania, you need to stand up and correct the record. You need to set the record straight. Okay? If you're at the grocery store, if you're watching the Final Four this weekend, you're cheering on the Syracuse Orange like I will be, and someone says...
He's from Syracuse, by the way.
And someone says that we underfund our schools, you tell them no. So let's set the record straight right now. In Pennsylvania, we spend $15,000 per student on K-12 education, okay? $15,000. That's $3,000 more than the national average, and it ranks very high compared to other states. If you ask the Department of Education, the federal Department of Education, they have us at 10th in the nation. If you ask the NEA, the largest teachers union in the nation, certainly this is a reputable source for someone like Governor Wolf, they have us at 6th highest in revenue per student. Okay, so clearly the issue with our education system is not how much funding we have. I would say that it's how that money is being spent. The interesting thing on education funding is that the only time that funding has actually been cut recently in Pennsylvania is under this administration. It's under Governor Wolf. It was December, just 4 months ago, when the governor vetoed $3 billion in state funding for public schools, which was essentially, well, it was a negotiating tactic. It was a game of political chicken. It was a way to get the General Assembly to give in to his demands on tax increases. So the governor is actually the only one who has cut public education funding. And you don't take that from me. You can ask the Secretary of Education in Pennsylvania, Pedro Rivera. It was only a couple weeks ago he testified before a House and Senate committee on this very topic, and he was asked about education funding. And we have the video. You can find it on commonwealthfoundation.org. He very clearly states Pennsylvania schools are among the highest funded on a per-pupil basis in the country, and he said that there were no cuts under the previous administration. Okay? And when you listen to Secretary Rivera or Governor Wolf talk about education funding, what I notice is that they are always talking about the inputs. They are talking about what are we putting in, how much are we spending, and that's it. It seems like that's only half the story. What about the outputs? What about student growth, student proficiency, graduation rates, test scores, anything besides just more funding? We don't hear that much from this administration. It always kind of baffles me. If you think about, look at Apple or Microsoft or any successful tech company. Can you imagine them saying, holding a press conference and saying, we spent several $billion creating this iPhone and it's going to be great. We spent all this money. No, what they're going to talk about is how good the product is. They're probably going to talk about how inexpensive it is, because in a free marketplace, products get less expensive and the quality goes up. But we don't see that, unfortunately, in public education. If you look at education funding on a national level, in the U.S., we spend more than just about every other country on a per-pupil basis on public education. But our test results don't really stack up to other nations. And in reading, I just saw a statistic. We rank 15 out of 36 developed countries in reading, 17th out of 36 in math, even worse in science. Okay? Now, Governor Wolf's approach is it's a one-track approach. It's very simple. It's the idea that if we pump more money into the system, we'll automatically get better outcomes. That all we need to do is raise taxes on families and small businesses and just spend more, and we'll get better results. The evidence certainly doesn't back that up. And it's why I'm a proponent of school choice. It's why I believe families should have options. It's why we know that families should be empowered to choose the school that's best for their unique circumstances, for their child's unique learning needs. And this isn't an indictment on public education. I mean, we can't possibly expect any one school to possibly be the best option for every student that could potentially walk into its doors. That doesn't make sense. But again, the Wolf approach is different. It's a one-size-fits-all public education, traditional public school only approach. And if you happen to support private schools or cyber schools or charter schools, this administration has actually actively taken steps to undercut those options. Look at cyber schools or all charter schools, really. The last two budgets from Governor Wolf, the first two budgets, have included deep cuts to cyber charter schools. They have proposed to eliminate the rainy day funds, the reserve funds for charter schools that allow them to be prepared in the event of financial difficulties. Wolf wants to cut education funding for special education charter students. And keep in mind, on the charter issue, these charter schools already spend and receive about 80% of what the traditional schools spend. So Wolf is even cutting further. He's taken steps to undercut a very successful private school choice program called the EITC, Educational Improvement Tax Credit. We could go on. In Philadelphia and in New York, there are examples of the Wolf administration getting in the way of charter schools and more options for families. So the bottom line, and what I'll leave you with, is that for someone who kind of has coined himself an education governor, I would say he has a very unusual way of showing it. He relies on myths to advance his agenda. He has a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to education. And if you are a family that has a different approach, if you have a different idea about how to educate your children, he's taken steps to undercut that.
So our state, or the proposals for more taxing, more borrowing, more spending aren't helping, but in fact maybe harming the very people the governor's professing. They have to benefit somebody along the way here, right? Oh, yes, we know. Well, Beth Ann Mumford, she is the State Director of Americans for Prosperity here in Pennsylvania. She knows precisely who is profiting from all of these tax, borrow, and spend ideas. Beth Ann?
Sure. So if you talk about taxing, borrowing, and spending as the path to success for Pennsylvania, we should be leading the nation, right? That's been our strategy for decades now. So the question becomes, if that's not what's achieving us success, then why do we continue to do that? Who benefits the most from the status quo and not changing the way we do business in Pennsylvania? James talked a little bit about Apple and some of the advances that we've had as a society that innovation has brought us, but we're not doing that in Pennsylvania. So you have to think about who benefits from where we are. And the people who benefit are the people who have access to the levers of government. And that is the unions, the state employee unions, who benefit from having access to the levers of government. And if that's who you are and that's how you model your activity, then what you want is expanded government and more money within that system, whether or not it benefits anybody else across the state. And I think that's what we see with this plan by the governor. The people who benefit the most are the people in charge of the unions, the state employee unions. They've got the money through access to the levers of government. They can use that money to advocate their own positions, maintain their own role as bosses in those organizations. I mean, it doesn't really matter. They're not accountable to the citizens in this state. And so I think that's what we've seen from the governor's plan. And if you look at December, when we ended up with a budget and the governor vetoed at that point, line item vetoed some of that as we got to the end of the year. If you're watching on social media, you could see union leader after union leader, the people who represent those state unions, demanding that the governor veto that budget. So we had schools asking for more money, we had social services organizations asking for something to get done because they couldn't serve the people that they were trying to serve. We had other groups and organizations looking for some solution. We were 6 months into our state's conversation about the budget, and there were people demanding that the governor veto the budget in late December, knowing that it was going to cause a lot more pain. And the people who were on social media, on Twitter and on Facebook, and talking to the news media were the people who represent those state employee unions. You can also look at what happened during the course of our budget discussion over 2015. There were a number of radio ads and mailers and other things that went out into a lot of legislative districts trying to pressure lawmakers into giving in and raising taxes. You've got America Works spending $1 million in that activity. America Works is funded also by the National Federation of Teachers, National Education Association, American Federation of Teachers, AFSCME union, the Democratic Governors Association. So the people spending money to maintain the status quo are those unions who don't want to see the kind of change that would really.
So one of the things that the governor leads with, and I'm going to open up for questions to all of you, and you can all answer them as you see fit. The governor claims that we have a so-called structural deficit. And what he means by that, and said maybe you can define what is meant by that. I believe that it's the amount of money we want to spend and the amount of money that we have to spend and the difference between the two. The governor wants, obviously, to spend a lot more. And he says that if we don't raise taxes, we're going to have to cut funds to schools. I think he even said we're going to fire 23,000 teachers if we don't raise these taxes. Is that our only alternative of raising taxes or firing 23,000 teachers?
So I think we need to define what a structural deficit is. I had a town hall meeting Wednesday night, and I was looking for actual definitions of structural deficits so I could go and actually explain to people what we're talking about. Most people assume a structural deficit is just like Matt. We have expenses up here and our revenues up here, and we have a gap. According to Reuters, a structural deficit is actually during your peak economic performance, you still have less revenue than your expenditures coming in. Now the question is, have we hit peak economic performance in this Commonwealth? Would anybody say we're at peak economic performance?
No.
Absolutely not. So there's a fallacy with that use of structural deficit. It's actually a cyclical deficit. Pennsylvania is usually one of the last states into a recession, one of the last states out of it. We're still in a cyclical recession. Now, you can also start your budgeting with the thought process is, oh, we have to raise taxes. Oh, we just have to. We've got to raise taxes. Let's raise taxes. You can start with that mantra, or you can be a little responsible and say, you know what? We spend our total state budget is over $90 billion. Federal dollars, state dollars. Now, our state dollars we appropriate every year is about $30 billion. So we spend a lot of money. And the question you have to ask yourself is all that money being used the best way it can? Is there extra dollars sitting there? Are there cost efficiencies and savings we can actually find so we don't actually have to raise taxes? And that's what we did this year. And I want to make a great point of the first budget that was vetoed by Governor Wolf was $30.26 billion. He got a $30.03 billion budget. We worked them backwards, backwards. So again, send your legislators an email and say thank you, positive reinforcement. Just don't buy into the fallacy that you automatically have to raise taxes. Commonwealth Foundation, AFP, they've all put together great positions and delve into state government, have options out there to say, if you do this, this, and this, you don't need to raise taxes. We're doing that at the General Assembly with the Taxpayers Caucus, with Carrie Benninghoff and the House Republican Policy Committee started Penn Saves. We're looking for every dime to turn over and not spend so we don't have to raise taxes. And that's what we need to focus on.
If any of you want to weigh in on that as well, I do want to ask you a question, Seth, as it relates to what we've identified as, $750 million in corporate welfare. Pennsylvania has been one of the highest spenders on so-called economic development in the country, in total dollars, in per capita dollars, no matter how you slice it. We are giving out a lot of money to corporations, multi-billion-dollar corporations. Why have we gotten in that habit, and why can't we break that habit as a means to not have to go back to the taxpayers?
Yeah, every single one of those economic development programs, those tax credits, start with us trying to attract some business into Pennsylvania, trying to grow those private sector jobs. Again, good in theory. Unfortunately, we don't track to see if there's any performance out of those tax credits, out of those corporate programs, or out of those economic development programs. Before the Appropriations Committee hearing on Department of Economic Development, I had a list, I think it's something like close to over 100 economic development programs. Most of them in DCD are dead. They're not funded, but they still have staff attached to them to do something. I'm not sure what.
Count the money that's
I guess
coming in.
that they should have to send out. But we need to do a full review and make sure there's actual. They're designed to do what they're going to do moving forward, and that's step one. And again, going into zero and performance-based budgeting. If you want to change the system, measure it and make sure it's performing the way you want to. So we need to develop metrics to move forward to make sure we're doing the right job and putting money where we need to. And not just the simple budgeting of, you got $2 million this year, we're going to give you 5% just because. It's not prudent to do that. It's not fiscally responsible to do that anymore. And we need to look at all those programs, every single last one of them, get rid of the ones that aren't working, make sure we have performance matrix built into them so we know we have a clear, measurable level of where we want to go as a Commonwealth.
David, I know you want to say something, but
Yes.
I just want to ask one question, because we heard Senator Wagner talk about zero-based budgeting. I know you support. Is that going to require statutory changes, or why can we not just impose that? Because you guys in the House, and you're on the Appropriations Committee, hold the purse strings. Why wouldn't you demand that of our executive branch when they come to you looking for more money?
Well, I think one of our problems is we have a governor that really doesn't care about statute or the Constitution. I think that's kind of problem number one.
I laugh, but it's actually sad.
It's a sad statement. We can, and it's a matter of getting those matrices down. Because your matrix for education is a lot different than your matrix for an ag program. So we need to sit down and ask those tough questions. And we don't have a lot of time during budget hearings to get into those details of, how is your performance? Are you meeting your goals? Are you actually moving from people from welfare to work to be productive members of society? It's not a culture or societal program. It is temporary help. We want you to be active members of society. How do we move you? Economic development programs. Are you continuing to create jobs, or are you just getting a tax credit to get a tax credit? Can we just get rid of these tax credits and reduce everybody's tax liability?
Hear, hear.
So everyone benefits, to bring some economic freedom to this Commonwealth. So it's those things we need to build into the process and do a much, much better job of. I don't know if a 2-year budget would allow that, so you kind of set your budget up year 1, and then year 2, you're just doing oversight and in kind of an analysis to see how everything is moving. But I think zero-based budget mixed with performance-based budgeting, set up the metrics, and we need to sit down and have those conversations with members to say, you know, what do we want out of our government? I think private sector job growth, that's where it's at. You know, hiring government employees just increases costs. I want people out there working in the private sector to grow jobs, and we don't do it, but we have a great, less regulation, less taxes, that's how you do it.
David?
Well, yes, and if I may, I want to expand on what Representative Grove just said, because he got at the heart of the problem, which is that in Pennsylvania, we use the same term to mean two different and almost opposite things, which is economic development. You know, I think of economic development as being a healthy, robust, growing private sector economy where wages are rising and job opportunities are expanding. But we also use that same term to describe government-directed, taxpayer-funded subsidization. And that Pennsylvania has...
It's kind of Orwellian, is it not?
Almost. And Pennsylvania has over-relied heavily on those kinds of subsidy programs because our economic fundamentals in so many cases are poor, whether it's spending and taxes or the regulatory burden or lawsuit abuse or the labor climate. All of those things affect the ability of employers to start operations, to invest, to hire, and to grow here, and that we need our leaders to focus on the baseline cost of creating and keeping jobs in Pennsylvania, and that yes, when we do that, we need to right-size our approach, and that kind of taxpayer-funded, government-directed subsidization should be much less necessary, hopefully not needed at all.
Beth Ann, you touched on how in December the unions were advocating for a veto and ultimately telling the governor, continue holding children hostage with the funding. They did the same in March,
yes,
when it was very clear we'd already spent $50 million in just interest costs on borrowed dollars for our schools and human services. They continued to advocate for a veto. How do we make sure that this special interest that really represents a fraction of our population don't have so much power over our legislature? Because you certainly saw it in the votes. It wasn't an overwhelming bipartisan vote to get money flowing to the schools, although you did see 13 House Democrats break ranks. But the power of the public sector unions, you had so many folks that were willing to say, yes, let's inflict more pain on schools in order to get massive tax increases on those kids' parents.
Yeah, absolutely, and they'll continue to do that as long as they're not challenged. And this is where taxpayers come in, because there are things that we could advocate for and that the legislature can do to kind of pull back some of the hold that they have on our public discussion. You know, paycheck protection, a place where we can, you know, in 2014, the union spent $10 million in elections in Pennsylvania. They do that through collecting dues from their members, both political dues, but also just membership dues, which they can then use to advocate for issues around which they're interested. So they're able to use taxpayer resources to collect their dues, and you know, there's some argument about whether or not that's significant within our budget, but it's just not ethical. So they're able to use the levers of government to make sure they've got their coffers funded so that they can then message on the issues that directly conflict with what taxpayers want: school choice, a government that has loosened the reins on business and on citizens to succeed. So what we need to continue to look for are ways within our public policy discussion to pull back some of the powers that they have with access to government. We've seen this across the country where other states have done this. Wisconsin, for instance, with their Act 10 law, were able to free up a lot of money for citizens and taxpayers to use in a way that they see fit, instead of for the unions to use in a way to just expand government to benefit the few who are at the top of those unions.
Representative Grove, some of those things have already passed, like the Senate. They passed paycheck protection, ending the collection of union political money. It's sitting in the House. Is that something that we should expect to see activity on here soon?
Hopefully. I think there was a bit of a wait over the Supreme Court case that unfortunately came back with a 4-4 tie. God rest Anthony Scalia's soul. I think that would have been a 5-4 victory where they would have removed the fair share dues. Hopefully we can renew that. We did caucus it. We had it filed on some amendments on the financial transparency for the contracts, which is a very important piece of legislation. Talk about unfunded mandates, where the governor negotiates the contracts and hands taxpayers a bill. I mean, it's plain and simple. We can't even account for it during appropriations hearings because they're secretive. So very important. Thank you for AFP's Commonwealth Foundation work on that moving forward. But hopefully we can renew the push for dues deductions. And we have a lot of members that saw, I think someone brought up all those postcards, which fired up the base. During the summer, as the governor was sending in political postcards paid for by teachers' unions in the state and nationally, it Southeast members who tend to be more pro-tax, it fired up the grassroots, and they heard 10-1 from their residents, hold the line, don't give Wolf a single thing. So it completely backfired, but that money shouldn't have been spent in the first place. So removing the politics out of it, and I think we have a couple former speakers that ended up in jail for using taxpayer dollars for political purposes. It's the same exact thing, collected by taxpayer dollars, collected and then spent on political activity. It should just stop. It's wrong.
Well, tax, borrow, spend, we know that only profits a few at the expense of the many. Thank you all for all your work you do to protect taxpayers. Please give this lady and gentleman a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.